Veil's gone! Hello, my name's Joe and welcome to my channel. So, hey, it's been a while since we talked, and a lot has happened. But that is not what we're talking about today, because while the future of RWBY may be uncertain, the present is, present. Because Rooster Teeth released a Volume 9 epilogue, aka the last episode that was planned and storyboarded, but was cut because of budget. And later this week, and the following 3 weeks afterward, they are releasing RWBY Volume 9 Beyond, which tells the stories that took place on Remnant during Volume 9 and even a little bit afterwards. But with this new content coming out, it reminded me of a question I had during the Volume 9 finale, which was how much time passed between the end of Volume 8 and when RWBY and Jaune leave the portal in Volume 9. And this question spawned another question of how much time has passed in general? Like, I know we have a vague idea of the amount of time that's passed since RWBY entered Beacon, but can we get a more specified timeline? And that's what I decided to do today. Try my best to create a RWBY timeline that went down to around the months that things happened in the story. I'm sure many people have done this before, but I wanted to give it my best go. And when I tell you that this was the most frustrating video I've made in the last year, you would think that maybe it would be the hour-and-a-half long RWBY My Hero Academia crossover What If I made. Check that out, by the way, I think I did a pretty good job on it. But no, it's the simple timeline! So much of the time frame given for the RWBY story is extremely vague and just broad strokes. And especially for the Beacon era RWBY stuff, a lot of the information is conflicting. Oh goodness gracious, what have I gotten myself into? Look, is it partially my fault for overcomplicating things? Yes. Would I do this again? Absolutely yes, because taking the easy way out is never taking the fun way. And the first thing I want to do is find when Beacon actually begins. So we should start with what we do know, namely how old the characters were when they started the show out. The most important character here being RWBY, who started at Beacon at age 15 when everyone else started at age 17. Next, we also know that RWBY's birthday is canonically October 31st, this being the first canonically established birthday in the entire show. And finally, we know that RWBY was still 15 at the time of Volume 3 because of what CL says to her. Well, at least that would be the case, if not for Eddie Rivas, one of the writers, making this comment on Reddit. He also says that the Beacon school year starts in around August or September, similar to school years in America. Now, while I will accept this as a canon answer, because no disrespect to the RWBY, I'm not going to argue that I know their show better than they do, I will not be using this information in this video because it does not make sense. Now, you might be wondering, why? And my answer to that is seasons, which are kind of an important thing in RWBY. As RWBY says in Volume 3, it's fall in Volume 3. And we can tell by the climate in Vale compared to Menagerie, as well as, you know, the compass rose in the corner of this map of Vale, that Vale is most likely in the northern hemisphere of Remnant. So unless we're saying that Volumes 1 through 3 take place in less than 3 months, or that Beacon both starts and ends its school year in September, this just doesn't make sense. Right, so when does the Beacon school year start? We know that Volume 2 starts at their second semester, but other than that, they've only given very vague time frames of months or weeks. Well, this, my dear viewer, is where the books come into the equation. RWBY, after the fall, holds the answer to my query, at least in vague terms. While much like the main series, the books tend to use very vague amounts of time to leave things open for storytelling, there is a single comment, a single ray of light that saved this video. And that was Fox Alistair's POV narration saying that he had spent a year and a half at Beacon. Oh, thank you, Fox. Man, if you keep this up, Collection's gonna have competition for your biggest fan. Right, so given Team Coffee is a second-year team, we can say that Team RWBY and Juniper were probably at Beacon for around 6 months. Though possibly closer to 5 given Team Coffee spent a few weeks at Beacon after the fall to try and help their teachers rebuild. Okay, so then we just try and work backwards from there. Though generally being in autumn is still pretty unspecific. We can narrow it down a little bit more though, because we also see in After the Fall that Coco believes it will take them 3 months to get to Vacuo. and it states that she hopes to get there before winter. And winter begins in late December. So if Coco believes that it will take them 3 months to get there, but there's still enough wiggle room that they may or may not be arriving before winter, I can pretty confidently say that they left Beacon in late September. Maybe early October if they're pushing it. Though I will say they had a weird line here that Coco was hoping they would make it in time for their second semester, which I think comes from the belief that the semesters go similar to how they do in America. But like, Fox said that they were at Beacon for a year and a half. Even if they weren't including those few weeks that they were trying to help rebuild, for them to not get there in time to just start their third year, those few weeks would have to equal 3 months, which is a bit excessive to call it a few weeks. I'm sorry, but the math just isn't mathing here. I'll also say that Volume 3 taking place largely in early September makes it a bit odd that some leaves are already falling, but I can forgive that because I think it's still the most elegant solution we have. Plus, it makes it so Ciel wasn't wrong about Ruby's age. Ruby's birthday just hasn't passed. Right, so going by that, we can say that the Beacon school year started probably somewhere in March. Either early March if Fox wasn't including his time trying to rebuild in those 6 months, or late March if he was. And honestly, I think the starting time works really well. One, because the other characters' birthdays would mean that Yang is 2.5 years older than Ruby rather than only 1.5 years, which personally I feel just fits their dynamic a bit more. And Jaune would be the youngest of the Beacon 8 aside from Ruby, having turned 17 only right before the Beacon school year started, which I just think fits the character better than being one of the older members of the group. You know, ever after time notwithstanding. And two, I think it gives some credence to the idea that Beacon might run on a kind of modified 3-term system, given the break between the first and second semester happened earlier than the halfway point in the year. And personally, I think that kind of fits, because RWBY was inspired by a lot of anime, and most school anime run on the Japanese school system. Alright, so we know when school started, we know when the Vital Festival happened. What about when Team Ranger set out for Haven? And this is tricky because we just know that there's snow on the ground. So, most likely sometime in winter. Obviously, we don't know the exact climate of Patch, so just having snow isn't that helpful. So, we kind of just have to work purely from a narrative sense, and because of that, I'm gonna say it's probably in early to mid-January. You know, a whole metaphor for a new year, a new journey. You know, hashtag new year, new me, all that. Which brings us to the time between Volume 3 and Volume 4. Now, and I'm sure many of you, have heard it said that the time skip between these two volumes is 6 to 8 months. Personally, I cannot find the source for this. I believe it was a question from a panel a few years ago, but the only link I found for it leads to a deleted video. Now, this information has been in the fandom for years, so I'm just going to use it for the purposes of this video, but if anyone does have contrary information, please let me know. You should always check the comments in these videos, because if I ever have to make a correction or clarify some misinformation, I'll make a comment and pin it down below. Okay, so 6 to 8 months is pretty specific for a time given by RWBY, but I think we can narrow it down a little bit more. Well, not really narrow down, I guess, but just clarify it. Because something that we gotta remember is that Team RWBY are working on different time frames throughout this volume. RWBY and the rest of Ranger are traveling for who knows how long within the volume itself. Yang and Weiss's storylines could take anywhere between a few days and a few weeks. And Blake's storyline is guaranteed to take place earlier than all the others, because as we can see in Volume 5, she needed time to move all of the people from Menagerie that were going to help at Haven. So I think the best way to take that 6 to 8 months is that each member is individually at different points in that 6 to 8 months when the volume starts. Blake obviously would be on the short end, probably at around exactly 6 months, for the reasons that I stated a minute ago. Yang probably isn't far behind that though, since she did need time to get to Anima from Patch, and then more time to find Shady Man who would take her to her mother. Team Ranger probably covered the entire span, with us first seeing them around 6 months into their journey and then different things happening over the next 2 months. I will say, I do think it's a little weird how long it took Team Ranger to get to where they were, when comparing it to the travel time of other characters in the show. But to be fair, Team Ranger does have a history of losing their map. Meanwhile, Weiss probably starts right at the tail end of that time span at 8 months, and then the course of her story and finding a way to leave Schnee Manor took some extra time on top of that. Alright, so that puts Ranger arriving at Haven at around 8 months. I'm also going to tack at least another month on top of that of them being at the house to give both Yang and Blake travel time. Because given how long it took Team Ranger, they really need it. Especially Blake, like, do you know how long it takes to RWBY transport as many people as she's taking? Honestly, I don't really know myself, so it could be really quick. But you also need to take into consideration that Blake did spend a while in Menagerie before she left. And with that taken into consideration, that puts us at around mid-October for when the Battle of Haven took place. Which honestly works really elegantly because Lindsay stated that RWBY was 17 as of Volume 6. And with Volume 6 canonically taking place 2 weeks after the Battle of Haven, oh thank goodness they actually gave me a concrete time frame within the show itself. Thank you. It makes it a really easy extrapolation to say that Volume 6 starts out in early November, right after Ruby's birthday. Though I will point out that in RWBY Rewind, Lindsay did say that they thought Ruby's birthday took place sometime in the middle of Volume 5, or they could have meant in the middle of Volume 6, I'm not really sure. So they could have spent longer in the house than I am positing here. Regardless, we're just gonna say Volume 6 takes place in November. I wouldn't go any farther than this though, because we know that Volume 6 still takes place in fall, given the leaves that we see when Jaune finds Pyrrha's statue. And that brings us to Atlas, with probably the most ill-defined time skip in the entirety of the show. Seriously, we have no frame of reference for how long RWBY spent in Atlas. Honestly, it only seems like maybe a few weeks, but well, the answer to this once again seems to lie in the books, with Sun's narration in Before the Dawn stating that it had been a few months since he and Team RWBY parted ways at the train station. Now, just to keep things well defined, whenever somebody has said a few in regards to a time frame, I am taking that to mean somewhere around 3 to 6. And the thing is, in this case, I feel like I have to go toward the upper edge of that, because of the fact that at this point in the book, Team Sun had already been in Vacuo for a month. And I'm sorry, but I refuse to believe that it took Blake 6 months to get from Vale to Menagerie, and that it took Coffee 3 months to get from Vale to Vacuo, but it only took Team Sun 2 months to get from Mistral to Vacuo. Especially when Neptune said that they hadn't even planned the trip yet. So I'm gonna put this few months between Argus Limited and Before the Dawn as being around 5 to 6, putting Team Sun as having gotten to Vacuo in around 4 to 5 months. Already, it's starting to seem like the trip between Mistral and Argus took longer than I was initially expecting, though I still can't see it being more than a few weeks. And in addition to that, Velvet's chapter in Before the Dawn states that it had been 3 months since she met a character that was introduced in After the Fall, Gus Caspian. This time frame does include the month that Sun was in Vacuo, but it leaves another 2 months hanging off the edge there. I looked through After the Fall again, and honestly, I can't see there being more than like a week or maybe 2 of time skips within that book. So pretty much this whole 2 months is going to be happening after Sun's month in Vacuo, probably between chapters 1 and 2. And this is kind of weird, I'm not gonna lie. The time frame in this book is honestly pretty confusing throughout, so to compensate for it, I'm just going to take the lower estimate on the time it took Sun and his friends to get to Vacuo, combining the two to be around 7 months between the Argus Limited and this point in the book. But that does pretty much bring us to the end of the timeline in the book. The epilogue mentions that it is a week later, and we could have gotten maybe a week of time movement somewhere in that book, so possibly another 2 weeks after this. But still, let's stick with the estimate of around 7 months for now. Which, given that Argus Limited takes place sometime in November, puts us solidly in June. Now, the reason I worked all of this out is because we know for a fact that the end of Volume 8 takes place after this happens, with all the Atlas refugees arriving in Vacuo. We also know, thanks to the epilogue, that Team Coffee, Sun, and Neptune all helped with the evacuation, meaning they weren't busy taking care of the events in the book. Certain parts in the epilogue also seem to imply that this takes right before the people from Atlas arrive in Vacuo, mentioning a storm brewing and them arriving right when a sandstorm was happening. This can't really be the case though, because we saw Sun and Neptune watching RWBY's message that was broadcast to everyone, and the evacuees from Atlas wouldn't have left Atlas until a day or 2 after that. Still, with the information we have, I don't see there being any significant time jump between these these 2 points. Again, maybe a week at most. So, most likely, we have our answer, with the entirety of the Atlas arc taking place in around 7 months, give or take a couple for travel time, and the fall of Atlas happening in June. If we take the maximum amount of time for certain time skips, we could probably bring that up to around August, but I'm not sure if we should. Already it feels weird that such a huge time skip happened, when it seems like it was only a few weeks that Ruby and Juniper were in Atlas. Though it is a little disappointing that the pattern of every final battle for a school taking place in fall seems to have stopped here. I just personally don't see how I can extend this amount of time to reach the fall. If you can think of something, let me know in the comments down below. Maybe it will help my headcanon. Let's also take a look at what that means for our main characters' ages. Ruby is obviously 17 at this point, whereas Weiss, Nora, and maybe Ren are probably around 20 by the end of Volume 8. Yang, Blake, and Jaune are all 19, as you would expect. Well, I'll admit, it's a little bit weird to see some of the characters' ages not match what you would expect for this period of time. I think the writers just weren't thinking about exact ages of the characters when they were giving them their birthdays, just trying to find ones that would fit. This brings us to the time skip that Remnant went through while Ruby and Jaune were all doing their business in the Ever After. Though I do want to bring up one thing regarding that, which is regarding Jaune's timeline. The amount of time that Jaune was in the Ever After was, as usual, pretty vague, the crew be just stating 10 to 20 years, so it's really up to your interpretation how long he was actually in there. And I'm gonna say that my headcanon is that it's probably closer to the end of 10 to 12 years. Sure, Jaune might look older than that, but most of that comes from the white hairs on his head and the bags under his eyes, which are also telltale signs of stress and exhaustion, which, as you might be able to tell, Jaune had in spades at that point. Plus, he was poisoned at one point, so who knows what kind of toll that took. And the way he looked throughout the storybook flashbacks was really inconsistent, so it's pretty hard to gauge. Narratively, even if you go by it only being 10 years, he still spent 5 years sitting on a beach, and then a few months with Alex and Lewis, and then another 5 years just repeating the same activity day after day after day with the paper pleasers. I think that accomplishes the goal of that story without reaching into the absurd with 10 years of each of those activities. Is this whole rationalization my attempt at relieving Jaune of even a little bit of that suffering? Yes, unabashedly it is. But that doesn't change my headcanon. There are many like it, but this one is mine. Alright, so that brings us to the moment we've all been waiting for. How long was it between the end of Volume 8 and when Jaune and Ruby arrived back on Remnant? While we might, hopefully, get more exact information in RWBY Volume 9 beyond, I think we can extrapolate a few things from what we know in the epilogue. Particularly the scene explaining that Vale is just gone, which is just absolutely wild, by the way. And the reason this scene is helpful to us is because while we don't have precedent for how long it would take Crow and Robin and the others to get from Atlas to Vacuo, we do have precedent for how long it takes to travel between Vale and Vacuo, which helps us determine how long it took for Port and the rest of the Vale residents to get to Vacuo after Salem destroyed Vale. Coffee, we know, took about 3 months to get to Vacuo, but I think it's going to take the residents of Vale a little bit longer. While we see that they have at least one airship that they're using to help evacuate, the scene seems to imply that a large majority of the people are on foot. They could have some other vehicles, or maybe they only recently transferred to being on foot after losing one of their air vehicles. But with the information we have right now, I'd have to say that it takes them probably closer to at least 4 or 5 months to get to Vacuo. Now, this is since Vale was destroyed, but how long did that take? Well, while we don't really know how long it'll take Salem to get from Atlas to Vale, we do know that she probably doesn't need to stop by home to pick up more Grimm because she has the Relic of Creation. While we don't know the exact rules for Ambrosius creating multiple things, I think it's safe to assume that Salem could use it to either create just an army of Grimm by telling Ambrosius to create 100,000 Beowulfs, or if she can't create multiples, just create one Titanic Grimm, because without having a Silver-Eyed Warrior around, I think that's all she's gonna need. So because of that, I think that it's safe to say it only took her another month or two max to destroy Vale after Atlas. And as for why she didn't immediately go to destroy Vacuo the same way, it's obviously because she needs to find the Summer Maiden so she can get the Relic of Destruction. And just raising the ground of everything would just make that search harder. So with that estimation, the citizens of Vale probably arrived in Vacuo around 6 or 7 months after the fall of Atlas, putting us into December or January. Now, how long after that did Team RWBY and Jaune reappear? Well, in Grow's section of the epilogue, it seems to imply that RWBY and Jaune arrived at around the same time as the fleet that we see above Vacuo. And we heard Port tell us that Glinda had gone to find help in the other kingdoms. So I think it's a safe assumption that she is probably with this fleet coming back to Vacuo. So here's how I think things went down. Crow told RWBY that she sent a message and the world listened. So I think it stands to reason that the military in Argus probably already sent reinforcements to Atlas, who arrived and are the ones who helped Pietro repair and upgrade Amity Coliseum. Meanwhile, Glinda went to Mistral and communicated with the huntsmen there to inform them that Remnant's last resistance was rallying in Vacuo. So probably at around the time or a bit before the residents of Vale got to Vacuo, Glinda and the rest of the forces would start heading there. And even though this is another really large group that normally would be pretty hard to move quickly, it helps a ton when you actually have a lot of vehicles designed to transport those people. Because of this, I'm going to estimate that they probably arrived only 2 or 3 months after the residents of Vale. So with that added time, it brings us somewhere between February and April. So I think it's safest to say that Team RWBY and Jaune returned in March. And thus, almost 3 years exactly after RWBY's journey started, she opened the door to its final chapter. But hey, those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And hey, the way may be uncertain, but we're together, moving toward the light. Remember to trust love, everybody, and until next time, safe journeys, my friends.